I think some people are going to be happy to hear this is not actually a sewing project. You don't have to have a sewing machine to do this project. So I've got my lampshade, I've got my my scissors, I got my fabric, and I got my lunch. So we are ready to roll on this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a template of the shade itself. Let me show you how to do it. What you need is your shade, obviously. You're going to need a marker. I'm using a Sharpie marker. You don't have to use a marker. I like a Sharpie because I'm left-handed and I get the smear stuff when I write. So I like a Sharpie marker. And then you also need a really large piece of paper. You can use a variety of things. You can use like brown or white craft paper. You could use parchment paper like you use in the kitchen. I'm using wrapping paper. Now, the paper is optional, so you don't have to make a template. You could just do it right onto your fabric if you wanted to. So the reason that I'm making a template is because I have 2 of these, and it's a little tricky, just a little, not a lot, but a little tricky to like get the roll thing and make the shape of it. And so I just thought it would be easier for me to make a template since I'm doing multiples of the same size. And then I can just cut all of them out using the template. But if you're only making one, or if you don't want to bother with the template and you don't mind rolling each section, then you can just go right directly onto your fabric. Be sure though that when you're marking on the back side of your fabric so you don't have pen mark on the pretty side of your fabric. I'm going to start by making a straight line across the top of my paper, about the height or the length, the height. So the height being, you know, from the bottom to the top, a line about that long. Across the top. You see how your shade is cone shaped? Not all shades are cone shaped. Some are drum shades, and they're all this, you know, they're the same all the way around, but most shades are cone shaped. So if your shade is cone shaped, you want to make sure that the small end of your shade is facing to the inside of your fabric or your paper, if that makes sense. I don't even know if this is really technically the inside, but what I mean is you're going to put your big side at the edge, towards the edge of your paper, so that you can roll the shade this direction. Okay, look at the back side of your shade. There should be a seam back there. In theory, that's a straight line. So what we're going to do is we're going to line up our seam with, I gotta put glasses on because I'm old like that. You want to line up your seam on both sides with the small end facing in towards your paper. Now what you're going to do, you've got it lined up on your line. Double check, triple check, make sure you got it right. You're going to start to mark right at the top where that line is that you made, and you're going to just make a little, you're just going to follow it along as you go. And then you're going to roll it a little bit. And you're going to do more, and you're going to roll it both sides. Okay, a tip that's important for you to know is that how you hold your pen is actually really important. Because if you hold your pen differently each time you mark on a side, it's going to affect the line. It's not going to be a straight line, it's going to be wavy. So you want to make sure that you're coming at it from the same angle every time on each side so that the line is consistent and not wavy. And you're just going to go back and forth, and you're just going to keep rolling all the way down until you get back to the seam again. When I get to the end, back to where my seam was, I'm going to mark like where that seam is on each side, because that's going to give me, then I can put my ruler on it and just make a straight line from it. However, I'm not going to mark exactly on that straight line, and I'll show you why. So go ahead and take this off. You can see I got a little bit of ink on the top of my shade. I don't really care because I'm going to cover it with fabric, so you're not going to see that ink. If you were using like a sheer fabric, then you might want to use something else to mark your paper with that can like be erasable. Like for example, you might want to use like some chalk fabric marker or something like that so that you can wipe it off the top of your shade if you're using something that's sheer, that you'd be able to see the marks through. Okay, so now I'm going to mark a straight line. Remember how I marked from the 2 seams? I'm going to mark a straight line. I'm going to use that as my mark points. Make sure it's lined up and it doesn't shift with your hand movement. That's not my cut point though. That's my marking point. And then I'm going to bring it out. And I say bring it out and then push my ruler in, but because I'm using, this is actually a great tool. If you craft or do anything creative, get yourself one of these. It's the best thing ever. But I'm going to give myself an extra 3/4 of an inch more beyond the end where the seam came to. when I wrap the fabric around the shade, I'm gonna turn this end piece under and create a pretty seam, because I don't want the raw edge that gets frayed and looks bad to be showing. I want it to be all pretty. And even if it's gonna be towards the back of a wall or whatever, for me, I don't want it to look unfinished. So, and there's always that chance you're gonna use it someplace different, and then you're gonna see the back side of the shade. So just finish it off nicely right from the get-go. So give yourself an extra about 3/4 of an inch to be able to fold over your seam on the end. Okay, so now we have our template. If you can see that, it's just kind of this curvilinear little template. That's gonna be the shape of our shade. Next, I'm gonna cut out my template, or if I'm just doing it straight out to my fabric, you can go ahead and cut out your fabric. You can use scissors. That's what probably most people are gonna use. I prefer to use a rotary cutter. I love a rotary cutter. It gives you a nice smooth cut. Sometimes a rotary cutter maybe takes a little bit of practice. It's worth practicing and it's worth getting used to. It's a really slick tool for crafting and creating things. I want a really straight line for my seams. I'm actually going to use my ruler, and I'm gonna cut my ends straight across. Now be careful with these rotary cutters. Not gonna lie, they're really sharp and they can be a little dangerous, and I actually cut the tip of my finger off with one of them one time. So yeah, so be careful that as you're working, that you're paying attention to where your fingers are on the ruler as you're cutting, because that's what I did. I like had my fingers spread out and I just cut the tip of my finger off. It was fine. They were able to sew it back on, and you can't even tell. It looks great. So now, because I'm going on a curve, obviously I'm not going to use my straight line. Rotary cutter, you get a nice smooth cut. When you get to the end, take your straight edge again and cut it straight. And voila, I have a pattern, and I have cute paper because I remember I used wrapping paper. One of the things that you want to always think about when you're working with fabric is how to utilize your fabric, if that makes sense. So don't just take your pattern and plop it down in the middle of right in the middle of your fabric, because then you're going to use up all your fabric. And like this fabric, I'm going to do these shades, and I'm kind of hoping there's going to be enough left over for like a cute pillow or something like that, so I can use it for something else. So consider that as you're laying this out. More important though than considering how much fabric you're using or how you're cutting up the fabric is the pattern on your fabric. If you're doing a fabric that has, or as we just showed, a paper that has a large pattern on it, you're gonna really wanna consider and analyze and think about it. And you can use this template and lay it out, which would be the advantage to using like kitchen parchment, where you can kind of see through it a little bit. Like I can't see through this, but I don't need to because my pattern is all small, but I don't have to really worry about matching a pattern. And the front of your shade, remember, is going to be that halfway point. So that's gonna be the front of your shade. So when you think about what you're gonna see with the shade, that center point that's your, where you wanna make sure, like if you're working with something with flowers or something like that, or if you're working with plaids, then you're going to want to make sure that your plaid lines up straight on that seam. Doing a cone-shaped shade with a stripe is a little tricky, because your stripes aren't gonna go straight up and down all the way around. I think you understand. It's wider at the bottom, so it's not really conducive to stripes. If you wanna do stripes on your shade and you wanna do them actually either horizontally or vertically, you're gonna wanna use a drum shade and not a cone-shaped shade. Okay, so normally I use fabric weights, but I'm in Huntsville and my sewing stuff is all in Draper. And so I'm using cups to weight down that works too, to weight down my thing. Again, if you're using regular scissors, you're gonna want to pin it, because as you move the pattern, it'll shift. Because I'm using a rotor cutter, it's gonna stay stationary, and with these weights on it, hopefully it's just gonna stay right where it is. Have you noticed that it's totally getting darker? It's not because it's getting later. Like it was beautiful and sunny, and now there's like this storm blowing in, the wind is howling, and like it's getting really dark and ominous, and I think we're in for a big storm tonight. Anyway, okay, so back to the shades. Something to mention is I am cutting these shades out exactly the same height as my shade. The reason that I'm doing that is because I am going to put a banded edge on the top and bottom of the shade. If you're not going to do that, if you want your shade just to be really clean with no trim or edging on it, then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take your template that you drew and draw another line on both the top and the bottom. And you're going to want to give yourself about 3/4 of an inch more fabric, because you're not just folding it over, you've got to go over the little wire bar that's inside there, and that takes up a surprisingly large amount. I mean, it's small, but you'd be surprised how much that little wire bar on the top and bottom takes to wrap your fabric around it. So I would give myself 3/4 of an inch, top and bottom. Add that to your template before you cut out your fabric. If you are planning to just wrap the shade, the fabric around the bottom of the shade. Use a high-tack spray adhesive on the back side, preferably one that works. All right, I have my fabric and I've sprayed it with spray adhesive on the back side. And I'm gonna do it, I want it to be straight. So I'm kind of setting it up on my grid right here so I can kind of see the lines, like how straight it is. I'm going to take a corner and I'm just gonna fold, just finger fold a little seam. And I'm gonna do it, I want it to be straight. So I'm kind of setting it up on my grid right here so I can kind of see the lines, like how straight it is. And I'm gonna just fold it up. Now that I've got it folded over, and so I've got a nice clean seam for the backside seam. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm going to use some framer's tape to make that edge sticky again, and even more sticky than what that, what you call it, the spray stuff, sticky spray stuff, spray glue. I'm gonna use framer's tape. So I put it down, it has a little paper backing on it. So once I pressed it in and I used a little tool, you can use a credit card or something. And then I'm gonna take that little paper backing off. And that's like really extra sticky. So it's gonna stay and hold really well. But it's not permanent, so that's nice too. Like if I decide to take it off, it wouldn't tear it all to pieces to try and take it off. Now some people might say it doesn't matter if I start on the seam because you know, the seam that's already existing is going to be covered. The thing is though, that seam is going to cast a shadow because it's darker where the seam is. So if you put your seam with your new fabric in a different spot, you're going to have two shadows casting because the light's going to come through and it's thicker, and so it's going to have a line. So rather than having two lines, you just really want to have one. It's going to look better. So work from the same seam that was there originally. So use the seam and line your fabric up along that seam, and because I've sprayed it with spray glue, it's sticky, and I can just press it in to my seam. See how I'm doing that? And then I'm just going to gently roll my fabric onto my shade, using the top as my guide to whether or not I've got it in the right spot. Because it's fabric, if you pull on it, it's going to stretch. So you kind of want to just be sure you don't pull it too much on the top or the bottom, that it stretches the top or the bottom differently than it does the rest of it. And it's perfect. And there's my lampshade so far. I am going to add some trim along the bottom and along the top, but I'm going to wait to do that until after I've done the rest of my shades.